She was dismissed the moment she stepped into Hawthorne Funeral Home. Maya Wilson's simple black dress and faded cardigan stood in stark contrast to the sea of designer mourning attire. At 32, she moved with quiet dignity, her unadorned flats making no sound on the Italian marble flooring as she slipped into the back row of the elegant chapel adorned with cascading white orchids and silver candelabras. The Montgomery family occupied the front rows, their collective grief performed with practiced restraint. Women in Chanel and Carolina Herrera dabbed at dry eyes with monogrammed handkerchiefs. Men in tailored Armani straightened their silk ties, Rolex watches glinting under the soft chandelier light. A trio of string musicians played Bach in the corner, the notes floating over arrangements of white roses that cost more than Maya's monthly rent. Vanessa Montgomery, with her perfectly highlighted blonde hair and Tiffany pearls, was the first to notice Maya. She nudged her husband Bradley, whose family money had merged with the Montgomery fortune through their strategic marriage 10 years ago. "Who let the help in?" Bradley whispered, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. "This is a private service." Maya's fingers tightened around the small leather-bound journal in her lap. Her grandfather's initials HCM for Howard Charles Montgomery were embossed in fading gold on its cover. Her hazel eyes remained fixed on the mahogany casket at the front, surrounded by arrangements of white lilies and sterling silver frames displaying photographs of Howard throughout his illustrious life. The memories came unbidden, Howard's gentle hands teaching her how to bait a hook at his lake house when she was 7, his rumbling laughter, the smell of his pipe tobacco. She had been his little butterfly, a rare bright spot in his otherwise calculated existence. 20 years had passed since then, a lifetime of estrangement until 3 years ago when fate had brought them back together. Maya's gaze drifted to the massive portrait of Howard displayed beside the casket. At 78, his silver hair and piercing blue eyes still commanded respect, his expression both stern and knowing. The official family portrait that had been chosen showed him surrounded by his proper family, the ones who had rarely visited in his final months, the ones who now occupied the front rows with their Italian leather shoes and Swiss timepieces. Maya remained in her spot, invisible yet unwelcome, a shadow at her own grandfather's funeral. The whispers spread like poison through the gathering. Cousin Vanessa's diamond earrings caught the light as she leaned toward her sister Elizabeth, their voices a practiced stage whisper. "Probably one of grandfather's charity cases," Vanessa said, her crimson lips barely moving. "You know how he liked his tax write-offs." Elizabeth's eyes, sharp as cut emeralds, flicked toward Maya. "Or the daughter of one of the housekeepers. Remember that Hispanic woman who worked the estate when we were kids? Always bringing her child around." Uncle Richard Montgomery, Howard's younger brother, made no attempt to lower his voice as he spoke to his third wife, Camilla. At 65, he wore his Seville rose suit like armor, his Harvard ring prominently displayed as he gestured. "Security should be notified," he declared, silver cufflinks flashing. "This is a private family event, not some community service." The funeral home staff, dressed in discreet black suits and trained in the art of invisible service, exchanged uncertain glances. No one wanted to approach the mysterious woman, not when the Montgomery family was paying premium rates for their exclusivity package. A man in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses, entered from a side door. Thomas Bennett, Howard's personal attorney for the past 20 years, surveyed the room with practiced neutrality. His gaze landed briefly on Maya, a flicker of recognition passing between them before he turned to speak with the funeral director. "Who's that woman?" demanded Jessica, Richard's daughter, pointing at Maya while adjusting her Bulgari bracelet. "Is she with the caterers for the reception? Perhaps she's confused about which service she's attending," offered Bradley, louder this time. "There's a public viewing in the East Wing for some retired schoolteacher." Maya adjusted her cardigan, a small callus on her right hand visible as she turned the page of her journal. The hands of someone who worked hard, who didn't pay others to manage life's difficulties. The Montgomery family noticed this detail, adding it to their growing catalog of evidence that she didn't belong. Howard's former business associates clustered near the viewing area, Their conversation a mixture of stock prospects and golf handicaps. Their wives, uniformly thin and expensively maintained, exchanged air kisses and compliments on new cosmetic procedures. None spared Maya a glance, their social radar programmed to acknowledge only those of appropriate status. Maya remained still, her breathing even, her focus unwavering from her grandfather's casket. To them, her silence was weakness, a confirmation of her insignificance. They couldn't see the strength it took to sit among those who despised her very presence. The service began with practiced precision. The minister, well versed in the comfort of vague platitudes, spoke of Howard's tremendous character and generous spirit without offering a single personal anecdote. Each word rang hollow in the cavernous room draped with imported silks and adorned with arrangements of out-of-season flowers. We gather to celebrate the extraordinary life of Howard Charles Montgomery, the minister intoned, his voice resonating through hidden speakers. Beloved patriarch, visionary entrepreneur, and philanthropist. The eulogy podium, carved from a single block of marble and engraved with the Montgomery family crest, became a stage for performance after performance. Richard spoke of his brother's uncompromising standards and brilliant financial mind. His voice cracked at precisely the right moment, a practiced catch that had served him well through board meetings and divorce proceedings. My brother leaves behind a legacy that will endure for generations, Richard concluded, his monogrammed pocket square making a carefully timed appearance to dab at dry eyes. Vanessa followed, her Jimmy Choo heels clicking across the marble floor as she adjusted the microphone. Grandfather taught us that excellence isn't optional, she declared, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light. He showed us that the Montgomery name carries responsibilities and privileges that must be honored. Throughout these performances, Maya sat motionless, her journal open but unread. Vanessa's 19-year-old daughter Madison, in a conservative Prada dress that did little to disguise her youth, snapped discreet photos of Maya with her rose gold iPhone. Found grandfather's charity case #crashing #awkward #thriftship funeral. Madison captioned the photo, tagging her fellow socialite friends who responded instantly with cruel emoji combinations. The minister invited any family members who wished to share to come forward. The emphasis on family was deliberate, a verbal barrier erected to keep outsiders at bay. A parade of Montgomery relatives approached the podium, each eulogy more performative than the last. Maya noticed the silver-framed photograph of Howard that had been selected for the memorial table, a formal portrait taken for Forbes magazine 15 years ago. There was no hint of the man who had taught her to fish, who had sent her secret birthday cards signed only your friend, who had finally reconnected with her after her father's death 3 years ago. The urn containing Thomas Bennett's attention was fixed not on the speakers, but on his watch. He checked it repeatedly, his expression growing more intent as the service progressed. At precisely 11:45, he rose and whispered something to the funeral director. The reception was held in the funeral home's heritage room, where crystal chandeliers illuminated oil paintings of pastoral scenes worth more than most suburban homes. Waiters in white gloves circulated with trays of champagne and canapés prepared by a Michelin-starred chef. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their instruments antiques worth 6 figures each. Maya stood near a window, observing the gathering without participating. Her reflection was faint against the backdrop of the Montgomery estate, visible through the glass 40 acres of manicured grounds surrounding the colonial mansion where Howard had spent his final days. Eleanor Montgomery, Richard's wife, approached with 2 friends trailing behind her like ladies-in-waiting. Her Louboutin heels sank slightly into the plush carpet as she stopped directly in front of Maya. The diamond on her finger, an 8-carat cushion cut that had been featured in Town Country's Heirloom Treasures spread, caught the light as she crossed her arms. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Eleanor said, her voice cultured and cold. "Are you with the event staff?" "Because the catering team is using the service in trance." Maya met her gaze steadily. "I'm Maya Wilson." "Wilson?" Eleanor's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched. "I'm not familiar with any Wilsons in Howard's circle." "I'm Howard's granddaughter." A beat of silence, Then Eleanor laughed, the sound like glass breaking. Howard had two granddaughters, Vanessa and Elizabeth, and one grandson, Christopher, though he couldn't be bothered to fly in from Monaco. My father was James, Maya said quietly. Howard's son. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. James Montgomery had been effectively erased from family history after choosing to marry a waitress from their country club 35 years ago. He had been disinherited, his name rarely spoken in Montgomery circles. James has been dead for years, Eleanor said, her voice harder now. And he certainly never had a legitimate child. People were watching now, conversations pausing as heads turned toward the confrontation. Richard joined his wife, his Patek Philippe watch gleaming as he checked the time with deliberate obviousness. "This is preposterous," he declared. "Security should be called immediately. This woman is clearly an imposter." Maya remained calm, though her knuckles whitened around her journal. "I'm not claiming anything. I'm just here to say goodbye to my grandfather." "Your grandfather?" Vanessa had joined the growing circle, her voice rising. "How dare you? Howard was my grandfather, not yours. You're nothing but a con artist." The confrontation had drawn a crowd now. Madison filmed with her phone, her expression gleeful at the drama unfolding. A waiter passing with a tray of red wine stumbled accidentally or with subtle purpose, sending a cascade of Cabernet across Maya's simple dress. "Oh, how clumsy," Vanessa remarked, making no move to help as the dark stains spread across the fabric. "But then, cheap material shows everything, doesn't it?" Maya accepted a napkin from a mortified server, her dignity intact despite the humiliation. "Excuse me," she said quietly, stepping away from the circle of hostile faces. As she dabbed at her dress, Thomas Bennett appeared at her side, his expression unreadable behind his professional mask. "Ms. Wilson," he said softly, "please don't leave. There's still the matter of the will reading." Thomas Bennett stood at the center of the heritage room, his voice cutting through the chatter with practiced authority. The crystal stemware stilled in manicured hands as all attention turned to him. "Ladies and gentlemen, in accordance with Howard Montgomery's explicit instructions, the reading of his last will and testament will take place immediately following this reception. He requested that it be conducted in his study at Montgomery Estate, with all family members present." Richard's hand tightened around his baccarat crystal tumbler. "Today? Surely this can wait until tomorrow, Thomas. It's been an emotional day." "I'm afraid Howard's instructions were quite specific," Thomas replied, his tone brooking no argument. "Cars are waiting outside to transport everyone to the estate. The reading will begin promptly at 2 o'clock. The room buzzed with speculation. Traditional etiquette dictated waiting at least a day after the funeral for such matters, but Howard had always played by his own rules, a trait that had helped him transform a modest inheritance into a billion-dollar empire spanning real estate, technology, and private equity. "Will all extended family be required to attend?" Vanessa asked, her gaze sliding to Maya. Howard's instructions specified that all family members present at the funeral must attend, Thomas answered, his expression neutral. "That includes Ms. Wilson." Bradley stepped forward, his custom Italian loafers silent on the carpet. "Now wait a minute. We don't even know who this woman is. She can't just walk into a private reading." "I have verified Ms. Wilson's identity," Thomas said firmly. "She is indeed Howard's granddaughter through his son James. And Howard specifically named her as a required attendee." The revelation sent shock waves through the gathering. Madison's phone captured it all, the outrage on her mother's face, the calculated anger from Richard, the stunned disbelief from the extended family. "This is outrageous," Eleanor declared, her tennis bracelet jangling as she gestured emphatically. James was disowned. Even if she is his daughter, she has no right to Howard's estate. Thomas smiled thinly. "Howard's wishes will be made clear during the reading. Cars are waiting. I suggest we proceed to the estate without delay." As the crowd moved toward the exit, Bradley positioned himself directly in Maya's path, his broad shoulders blocking her way. "Listen," he said, his voice low and threatening. "I don't know what game you're playing, but the Montgomerys have dealt with gold diggers before. You're out of your league." Maya met his gaze without flinching. "I'm just following my grandfather's wishes." "He wasn't your grandfather," Bradley hissed. And whatever scam you're running ends today. Thomas appeared beside them, his presence causing Bradley to step back. Ms. Wilson, your car is waiting. Mr. Harrington, I believe your wife is looking for you. The procession of luxury vehicles, Bentleys, Mercedes, and BMWs departed the funeral home like a caravan of modern aristocracy. Maya rode alone in a black town car, her stained dress drying stiffly against her skin, her journal clutched in her lap like a talisman. Howard Montgomery's study occupied the eastern wing of the estate, its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Shelves of leather-bound first editions lined walls paneled in mahogany harvested from sustainable forests Howard himself had purchased in the 1990s. The Aubusson carpet beneath their feet had once graced a French chateau, its muted colors telling stories of centuries past. The family arranged themselves according to an unspoken hierarchy. Richard claimed Howard's chair behind the Chippendale desk, a power move that drew disapproving glances from Thomas Bennett. Vanessa and Elizabeth positioned themselves on the leather Chesterfield sofa, while their husbands stood behind like sentries. Eleanor perched on an antique Hepplewhite chair, her back straight, her expression severe. Maya found a spot near the window, apart from the others. The wall beside her featured Howard's most prized possessions, framed photographs of him with presidents and prime ministers, his honorary degrees from Yale and Princeton, the scissors he'd used to cut the ribbon on Montgomery Tower in Manhattan. Hidden among these treasures, so small it was easily overlooked, was a single silver frame containing a faded photograph of a young man holding a fishing rod, a small girl beside him laughing as she held up a sunfish. James and Maya, 25 years ago, at Howard's lake house in Vermont. Thomas arranged his papers on the desk, gently but firmly displacing Richard, who moved to stand by the fireplace with evident reluctance. The lawyer opened his briefcase, a handcrafted piece from a third-generation Florentine leather worker, and removed a sealed envelope and a small digital device. "Before we begin," Thomas said, his voice resonating in the book-lined room, "I must inform you that Howard left very specific instructions for this proceeding. This is not a traditional will reading." Richard frowned, his manicured fingers tapping against the mantelpiece where a collection of Fabergé eggs was displayed. "What exactly does that mean, Thomas?" "A will reading is a will reading." Howard recorded a voice memo that must be played before the contents of his will are disclosed, Thomas explained, holding up the small device. He was quite insistent about this. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably, her Louboutins sinking into the priceless carpet. "Is this really necessary? We all know what the will contains. The Montgomery assets pass through the family line, as they have for generations. Nevertheless, these are Howard's instructions," Thomas replied, his tone making it clear the matter wasn't open for discussion. The voice memo first, then the will. The family exchanged glances, a current of unease running through the room. Maya remained by the window, her reflection ghost-like against the backdrop of the Atlantic. The stain on her dress had dried to a dull purple, but she stood with the quiet dignity that comes from within rather than from designer labels. Thomas placed the device on the desk and pressed play. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Howard Montgomery's voice filled the room, strong, clear, unmistakable, despite the illness that had claimed him. "If you're hearing this," Howard's voice began, rich and commanding despite his illness, "then I've finally left this world behind. I hope the service wasn't too maudlin. I've never had patience for excessive sentiment." A nervous chuckle rippled through the room. "So like Howard to begin with dry humor, even from beyond the grave. But sentiment isn't why I've gathered you here. Truth is, hard, uncomfortable truth." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Richard shifted his weight, the ancient floorboards creaking beneath the carpet. 3 years ago, after my son James died, I received a letter. It was from my granddaughter Maya, whom I hadn't seen since she was a child. James and I had our differences this family ensured became permanent, but in his final days, he asked Maya to reach out to me. Vanessa's perfectly manicured nails dug into the leather sofa. Eleanor's face had gone pale beneath her expensive foundation. Maya came to see me without agenda or expectation. She wanted nothing but to fulfill her father's last wish. I was suspicious at first. The Montgomery fortune attracts opportunists like flies, but Maya proved herself different. She never asked for money, never leveraged our relationship. She simply offered companionship to a dying old man. Maya's eyes remained fixed on the ocean beyond the window, though a single tear tracked down her cheek. What none of you know is that the cancer diagnosis I received 6 months ago wasn't my first. I've been living with terminal illness for nearly 3 years. My doctors gave me 6 months. I've survived through sheer stubbornness and because of Maya's care. Gasps filled the room. Richard's face flushed with anger. That's impossible, he sputtered. We would have known. The recording continued, Howard's voice cutting through the objection. For 3 years, Maya has been visiting me 3 times a week. She's driven me to treatments, held my hand through the worst of it, read to me when my eyes were too tired to focus. She arranged for private nurses rather than sending me to some sterile facility. She did this quietly, without fanfare, asking nothing in return. Vanessa looked stricken. I don't understand. We visited you regularly. Did you? Howard's voice had taken on an edge. Let me be specific. Vanessa, you visited twice in 3 years. Both times, you spent less than 30 minutes and spent most of that time on your phone. Elizabeth, you came once, with your children, who broke my baccarat crystal vase and were never disciplined for it. Elizabeth's face crumpled, her hand covering her mouth. Richard, my dear brother, you stopped by quarterly, always with paperwork requiring my signature for the company. You never once asked how I was feeling. Your visits averaged 12 minutes. Richard's knuckles whitened as he gripped the mantelpiece. I had my security team log every visit, every interaction. I've been watching and listening. The staff reported back every comment, every complaint about the old man taking too long to die. The silence in the room was absolute now. Even the ocean beyond the windows seemed to hold its breath. I designed a test, a final exam, if you will. I instructed Maya to attend my funeral dressed simply, to remain quiet, to observe. I wanted to see who among you had the decency to treat a stranger with respect. I wanted to know if any of you could recognize goodness without the trappings of wealth to signal it. Bradley loosened his tie, suddenly finding it difficult to breathe. From the reports I've received, and yes, I had people watching you failed. Spectacularly. I've spent my life building wealth, but I failed to build character in this family. Howard's voice had taken on a tone of weary disappointment. Today's behavior confirms what I've suspected for years. The Montgomery name has become synonymous with entitlement rather than excellence. The digital timestamp on the recording showed it had been made just 2 weeks ago, when Howard's illness had entered its final stage. The family sat in stunned silence, the implications of his words sinking in like stones in still water. I should clarify something important. Maya Wilson is indeed my granddaughter, the daughter of my son James and his wife Sarah. The marriage I foolishly opposed because Sarah worked as a waitress at our country club, a woman I deemed unsuitable for a Montgomery. Eleanor made a small choking sound. Richard's face had gone from red to ashen. James died of heart failure 3 years ago. His last request was that Maya reach out to me not for money or recognition, but because he believed in reconciliation. He was a better man than I ever was. The recording paused, and the sound of Howard's labored breathing filled the room. Maya has been my caregiver, my companion, and my conscience these past 3 years. She moved into the guest house to be closer during my treatments. She handled my medications, coordinated with my doctors, and most importantly, treated me not as Howard Montgomery the billionaire, but as her grandfather. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her journal tighter. She's read to me from that journal. She carries her father's journal, filled with letters he wrote to me, but never sent. Years of unsent forgiveness that I didn't deserve. Vanessa stared at the simple leather-bound book in Maya's hands with new understanding. Now, specific to today's events, I instructed my security team to record everything. Madison posting mocking photos of Maya online. Bradley physically intimidating her. Eleanor suggesting she came through the service entrance. The accidental wine spill orchestrated by Vanessa. Madison shrank in her chair, her phone now clutched against her chest, as if to hide the evidence. I've watched you trade on the Montgomery name while embodying none of its original values. My father built this fortune on integrity and innovation. You've maintained it through exclusion and entitlement." Richard started to speak, but Thomas held up a hand, gesturing for silence. "Maya is the only one who showed me the meaning of family. Not obligation, not appearances, not financial ties, but true, unconditional care. She is a Wilson by name, but she's more Montgomery than any of you in the ways that matter." The recording paused again, Howard's breathing becoming more labored. "I've had 3 years to consider my legacy, not the buildings with my name on them or the companies in my portfolio, but the impact I'll leave on the world. And I've decided that my final act will be one of both justice and mercy." Thomas Bennett straightened the papers before him, his expression solemn as Howard's voice delivered the final verdict from beyond. "To the staff who have served this family with dignity despite often being treated with none, Evelyn, Michael, Joseph, and Maria, I leave $1 million each and full retirement benefits." Thomas nodded, making a note on his legal pad. "To Nurse Heather Reynolds, who provided compassionate care during my final months and who treated Maya with respect at today's service, I leave $2 million in funding for the nursing scholarship program she proposed to me last year." There was a shifting in the room as the family processed that strangers were receiving significant portions of the inheritance they had counted on. "To my brother Richard," the room stilled. Richard straightened, adjusting his cufflinks. "I leave the Montgomery family summer house in Cape Cod and an annual stipend of $50,000. Richard's face flushed with outrage. "50,000? The property taxes alone are." "The house is placed in an irrevocable trust," Howard's voice continued, "which will cover maintenance and taxes. The stipend is non-negotiable and cannot be supplemented from other Montgomery assets." Richard sank into a nearby chair, his legs suddenly unable to support him. "To my nieces Vanessa and Elizabeth, I leave $25,000 each annually. Not enough to maintain your current lifestyles, but enough to prevent true hardship if managed wisely." Vanessa made a sound like a wounded animal. Elizabeth began to weep quietly. "To Bradley, nothing. Your attempt to intimidate Maya disqualifies you from any consideration. The prenuptial agreement you signed with Vanessa means you have no claim to Montgomery assets upon divorce, which, let's be honest, is likely imminent given your relationship with your personal trainer." Bradley's face drained of color. Vanessa turned to him, shock replacing grief. "To Madison, I leave a challenge. 1 year of community service with the Montgomery Foundation, working directly with our educational initiatives in underserved communities. Complete this successfully, and you'll receive funding for your education and a $1 million trust fund that matures when you turn 30. Fail, and you receive nothing." Madison looked up from her phone for perhaps the first time that day, her expression caught between outrage and calculation. "To the remainder of the family, small bequests are outlined in the formal will. Nothing that will maintain your current lifestyles, but enough to provide transition if you choose to embrace actual work." Thomas flipped to the next page of his notes as Howard's voice softened slightly. "And to Maya Wilson, my granddaughter in every way that matters, I leave the bulk of my estate. This includes controlling interest in Montgomery Enterprises, all real estate holdings except those specifically mentioned, my personal investments, art collection, and liquid assets." The room erupted in protests. Richard slammed his fist on the desk. "This is outrageous. She manipulated him during his illness." On the contrary, Howard's voice cut through the chaos. "Maya repeatedly refused my offers of financial support. She took a leave of absence from her teaching position to care for me, living on her savings rather than accepting what she called payment for family duty." Maya closed her eyes, tears streaming freely now. "The estate is valued at approximately $4.7 billion. Maya will also head the Montgomery Foundation, overseeing our philanthropic work with the same compassion she showed me." Thomas held up the formal will. "Everything is legally binding, witnessed, and executed according to state law. Howard had multiple psychological evaluations confirming his competence. Any challenges will be vigorously defended by the firm. I've arranged for a video compilation of Maya's care over these past 3 years," Howard's voice continued. "Should anyone contest this will, That compilation, along with recordings of your own neglectful behavior, will become public record. Richard collapsed back into his chair, defeated. Maya, Howard's voice softened, speaking directly to her now. You showed me what family truly means. Use this wealth better than I did. Build instead of hoard. Include rather than exclude. And know that your father would be proud of the woman you've become. The recording ended. The only sound in the room was the gentle ticking of the antique grandfather clock that had stood in that study for over a century, marking the passage of time through generations of Montgomerys, now ending with Maya Wilson. The exodus from Howard's study resembled a funeral procession of a different kind, the death of expectations, of entitlement, of a certain future now rendered impossible. Richard leaned heavily on Eleanor as they departed, his earlier arrogance deflated like a punctured balloon. Vanessa and Bradley left separately, the space between them already widening into an unbridgeable chasm. Maya remained in the study with Thomas, the ocean beyond the windows turning golden in the late afternoon sun. The lawyer gathered his papers with practiced efficiency, his expression softening as he addressed her. Howard spoke of you often these past few years, he said, closing his briefcase. He said you gave him something he'd never had despite all his wealth. Peace. Maya brushed away a tear, her fingers tracing the worn leather of her father's journal. I didn't do it for this, she said quietly, gesturing to the study, to the estate, to the empire that was now inexplicably hers. I just wanted to know him. For my dad's sake at first, then for my own. Thomas nodded. I know. That's precisely why Howard made his decision. He hesitated, then added, There's one more thing he asked me to give you. Privately, he removed a small velvet pouch from his pocket and placed it in her hand. Inside was a tarnished silver pocket watch, its face cracked, its hands frozen at 4:17. Your father's watch, Thomas explained. The one he was wearing when he stormed out of this house 35 years ago. Howard kept it in his desk drawer all these years. Maya cradled the watch, this tangible piece of her father's history, this evidence that her grandfather had never truly let go. What will you do now? Thomas asked. The board will need to be notified. There will be transition plans, press releases. Tomorrow, Maya said, her voice finding new strength. Tonight, I just want to sit with him. Thomas understood she meant the memory of Howard, not his physical remains. He nodded and took his leave, closing the study door behind him. Alone, Maya moved to the chair behind the desk, Howard's chair, now hers. She placed her father's journal beside the silver paperweight shaped like a sunfish, a quiet testament to that day at the lake so many years ago. Then she opened the watch, revealing an inscription she'd never seen before, etched in fading script inside the case. To my son, time passes, love remains. Beyond the windows, the sunset painted the ocean in shades of amber and gold. From this height, she could see the Montgomery estate in its entirety, the gardens her grandfather had walked with her, discussing native plants and conservation efforts, the guest house, where she'd stayed during his illness, the private road that had led her back to the family that had once rejected her. Maya didn't want the fortune, had never asked for it, had never expected it. But she understood now what Howard had done. This wasn't just about money or punishment or even justice. It was about legacy, about choosing what values would carry forward under the Montgomery name. The empire would continue, but with different priorities. The hospital wing her grandfather had funded would be expanded. The educational initiatives would reach more underserved communities. The family name would come to stand for inclusion rather than exclusion, for giving rather than hoarding. As darkness fell, the security lights came on across the estate, illuminating the grounds where generations of Montgomerys had walked. Maya Wilson, teacher, caregiver, granddaughter, sat in the quiet study, a simple woman now entrusted with an extraordinary responsibility. Tomorrow would bring challenges, resistance, perhaps even legal battles. But tonight, in the growing darkness, she whispered a promise to her grandfather, to her father, and to herself. I'll make it matter. In the end, Howard Montgomery's true wealth hadn't been in his bank accounts or his properties or his investments. It had been in the recognition, however belated, That character transcends circumstance, that a woman in a simple dress with a pure heart was worth more than all the tailored suits and designer dresses money could buy. The antique clock struck 9, its chimes echoing through the empty halls of the Montgomery estate. A new era had begun.